Hi there, in this video I'm going to build a risk matrix based on an Excel file which contains a risk register. The original version, because this is a revised version of that video, the original version contained some organizational specific data that wasn't allowed to be shared. So I removed that part of the video and I only keep the risk register that I created myself, as well as the Power BI file that's incorporated. Now this is an Ask Me Anything video because this came from a newsletter subscriber, or the question came from a newsletter subscriber. If you want to ask me some questions yourself, drop them in the comments below, or feel free to subscribe to the newsletter. There's a link there as well. Without further ado, here is the risk matrix in Excel and Power BI. And as you're already familiar, I have a 3x3 grid and a 5x5 grid in my videos. So I created two tables. Each of these tables has a nice table name, table 5x5, table 3x3, and it has a couple of required values. Now these required values are needed for reading purposes, such as the risk name, the project name, the owner, and for the visual itself, impact, probability, and risk ID. These are the bare minimum values that you need. But as we've already seen in previous videos, I append additional data. And here's the explanation of some of that additional data. When we're looking at a 3x3 grid and we want to have the impact and the probability, then the impact is 1 to 3 and the probability is 1 to 3. On a 5x5 grid, it goes from 1 to 5. And of course we have categories as well, and we remember from the Synoptic panel risk matrix that we have a grid of 9 values in a 3x3 grid, and we have a grid of 25 values in a 5x5 grid. Apart from the required fields, we also have some optional fields. And these optional fields are category, once again, something that you want to slice and dice on. Financial impact, very important to have a financial value of your risk. Instead of using measures in Power BI like we did in previous videos, I already included the impact numerical and probability numerical values so that we have an option to find out which grid value we have in the 3x3 and a 5x5 situation. Now these values are done by hand, but on the impact numerical and the probability numerical, I created a formula. The risk name itself is actually a formula as well, where I take the concatenate formula and I state that it's not enough for the category for owner on project. So not enough resources for Erik on project 1. With this data, I can now create risk matrices for Power BI. Now before we dive in creating the risk matrix in Power BI, I want to state a couple of prerequisites. We've already mentioned the required fields in the table and the fact that we need a table value, such as table. Now, in order to create a table, you just click on Format as Table, and it automatically finds the whole table, and you make sure that it has the correct column headers. Now, the Excel sheet needs to be inside a online environment. This could be either a SharePoint document library or, in my case, a OneDrive for Business location. So with that said, let's build this risk matrix in Power BI. I'm saving this and I'm closing it because, as you might be aware, you cannot import a Excel sheet once it's open. Now, I already prepared a little bit in my risk matrix Excel file, which you can download from the newsletter membership. I have the 3x3 grid and the 5x5 grid, and what I'm using here in this example is the Synoptic panel visual. And in case you're not familiar with the Synoptic panel, here is the example that I used in my previous video, where I have the 3x3 grid and I have a 5x5 grid. So let's head back to our risk matrix Excel example. As you can see, I just copied them from the original, and you can see that there's all things wrong here. Well, it's wrong, of course, because there's no data. So let's head on over to the Excel workbook, and I'll locate the OneDrive for Business location for the TPC examples. Just like the supermarket example from previous video, we also have the risk matrix TPC. I'll click on open, and it will find the tables that we've surfaced. And be aware that there's also this suggested tables, but yeah, it just gathers all the count values here. It just takes the values that we know from the grid that we had as an example. So what we're going to do is we're going to add these two tables, and instead of loading, we always want to try and transform the data, see if it's correct enough for us to do our work. Now, because the data is quite simple, we can see that the information is quite okay. We have a value here for the risk ID, we have risk name, owner, project, impact, probability, category, all textual values. Then we have the financial impact, which is a number, and we want to change that into a fixed decimal number because we're going to have this as a financial value. Now, impact, probability, cell value are all okay. So let's head on over to the 3x3 grid and make a check there. This all looks fine. And we're going to change this one again into the fixed decimal value. And we're going to replace the current. With that small change made, let's click on close and apply. Now we are going to make our life a little bit easier by using DAX. So for the 3x3 grid, I'm going to create a new measure, and I'm going to copy that measure from my notepad. And that measure is called risk count 3x3, in which we calculate the count of the risk ID. So let's click on the check mark. It's a whole number. It won't be, it doesn't have any decimals, and yeah, that's about it. Let's create the same measure for a 5x5 grid. And once again, I'm going to copy this from my notepad. In here, we have the risk count 5x5, which is also calculate on the count of the amount of risk IDs we have in the 5x5 table. So now that we have these two, we're going to populate our 3x3 grid example. Now, for the details on how the Synoptic panel works, please visit that video, which I'll have a link in the show notes, and it will pop up on the top right corner, of course. For the 3x3 grid, what we do is we have the cell value 3x3. We're going to add that to the category, and we'll add the risk count to the measure. And just like that, we have our risk matrix. Now, if we select any of these values, we'll see that the data is in there. Now, what we can do is we can add a little table here. And that table will contain the risk name as well as the project and the owner. And as you can see, there's not enough quality for Bill on project 2. And on this one, we'll have two values, one for owner Erik and one for owner Will. Now let's do the same for the 5x5 grid. It is exactly the same actions that we've done previously. The cell value, going to category, and the risk count is going to the measure, and once again we have our risk matrix. Now be aware, I have a filter selected here which screws up my data on the right side. So if we only have a 3x3 grid, you won't be bothered by this little filtering issue that we have here. But if we click outside of the risk, we'll see that we have the risk matrix as we had it previously. So I can again select any of these values and we'll see the risk matrix responding, and we can also have that little table here, adding that one on top. And once again we have the risk name, the project, and the owner. And let's make sure that we have the correct value. We can also add the cell value here. And once that's populated, we see that this is cell number 25, which is accurate to what we would expect to see. So in order for the risk matrix to be successful, it just has to have a few values. It needs to be in an online environment, and you want to have one of the variations of the risk matrix that I shared in the previous videos. So I hope my explanation was clear enough regarding the risk matrix and how to create the risk matrix based on an Excel file. Let me know in the comments below if you like this kind of video. It's in Ask Me Anything, and please feel free to ask me anything. The way to approach me is by clicking on the subscribe to the newsletter, a link that's in the show notes, and make sure to like this video if you did, because then I'm aware that this kind of video is exactly what my community likes to see. With that, have a great day, and I hope to see you next time.